Hi, everyone. We're just waiting a minute to let everyone filter in, but we'll be getting started with the program shortly. So I think we can get started. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I'm really excited about today's discussion. When I started at Stimson almost exactly a year ago, I inherited a fascinating multi-year research project focused on nuclear security governance. Good governance is essential for good nuclear security. It creates the organizational structure that helps to support all of the other elements of nuclear security, including the critically important element of a security culture. The question Stimson was asking itself is how nuclear operators can assess and communicate their governance practices. The answer came in the form of the nuclear security governance template that we're going to be discussing today and that you'll see on your screen shortly. And I'm going to bring it up right now so you can see a sample of the template. There we go. The nuclear security template that you can see on your screen right now offers nuclear operators an adaptable and dynamic tool for demonstrating how they have gone beyond the minimum regulatory security requirements to foster an environment that promotes continuous improvement, adapts to evolving risk, and makes nuclear security a core value. Nuclear security facilitates a wide range of nuclear facilities face a wide range of challenges, from insider threats to cyber intrusions, and the consequences of failure can be catastrophic. The template helps leaders define, communicate, and improve security-related management decision-making processes and systems without divulging sensitive information. And what you can see on your screen is a sample of the tool that we've created. And it helps operators communicate internally their processes for creating nuclear, for strengthening nuclear security. It helps communicate with the regulator these processes, and it helps to strengthen confidence that the public has in nuclear security operations. And the way we've organized the sample of the template is into sections, good practices, and question sets. And the sections are based on leadership, on what we think are some of the key aspects of nuclear security, for instance, leadership and oversight. The good practices are based on internationally accepted recommendations from both international institutions, but also NGOs on what are good practices for implementing nuclear security. And then the question sets are questions that operators can ask themselves about how they're engaging in these practices. Obviously the sample we have here is just part of what an operator can be doing. These questions can be adapted to specific situations. One can add additional questions and create new categories based on the circumstances, because nuclear security is something we should always be seeking to improve upon, and this is a tool that helps to do it. So to talk about the concepts that are underlying the nuclear security template, we have three really excellent speakers who can speak to different elements of how it was developed, where the concept came from, and the concepts that are underlying the template. And before I introduce them, I just want to thank the MacArthur Foundation for its generous support of this project, all of those who have provided feedback and expertise on the template, my colleagues Trin Lay and Jackie Kempfer from Third Wave for helping to organize this event. It's been a really fascinating journey to put this project together, and I'm really excited to introduce it and talk about it this event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Stephen G. Burns, former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Commissioner Burns served as commissioner of the NRC from 2014 through 2019, and was designated chairman by President Obama from January 15th until January 2017. Prior to his service as commissioner, he was the head of legal affairs at the OECD, Nuclear Energy Agency in Paris, from 2012 through October 2014. And I'm really excited that he's here to speak today about concepts related to the template. He has a long and storied and fascinating career in the nuclear field. And without further ado, Commissioner Burns.
There we go. Well, thanks, Nicholas. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak this morning, and also to hear from Deborah and Catherine, who I've known for some time, regarding more details of the template. Nuclear security, as well as safety, has been sort of at the heart of my career as a regulator since I joined the NRC in 1978 when I was a little boy. Right out of law school until I ended my service as a commissioner not quite two years ago. And it's always good to re-engage on this subject because while I'll speak in terms of what I think industry can do and what organizations are responsible for operating plants can do, it's not unlike what we as the regulator had to do in terms of building public confidence in terms of what we were doing, how we were taking out our work. And we sometimes did very well, and sometimes we stumbled, and we had to learn from those stumbles. So if one asks, what do I do to strengthen public confidence? I could give a very short answer and we could go on. Just run your plant well, don't violate any requirements, don't have any mishaps, avoid any bad press. We're done. But as we all know, that's a difficult job or a difficult goal to accomplish. And obviously, confidence is a byproduct of the competence of an organization and how it accomplishes its mission, whatever it is. And I've experienced that, as I said, as a regulator. And I've seen it in the industry that I was involved in regulating over the years. And again, examples of good performance and poor performance illustrate how confidence can be achieved and how it can be a loss. And I find the Stimson project particularly interesting because it focuses on addressing security not only from the standpoint of internal corporate values and performance and effectiveness, but also from the standpoint of how one engages stakeholders who have an interest in the outcome of that performance at a plant or by that company. And security is also an interesting thing because it's not something that is solely the role of the licensee or the operator. It's also there's an important governmental role, and those types of relationships are very important, and that type of integration. I go back to early days of the NRC, still the Atomic Energy Commission in the 1960s, and this notion that was developed about the enemy of the state. And we had a lot of debate and argument about that after 9/11. After all, is the terrorist, who is this terrorist? That's an enemy of the state. It's not a state actor. Maybe it's supported by a state actor. But why am I responsible as the operator for that? And what has developed is really this integrated roles and responsibilities between government and the operator. And that's what's extraordinarily important in the security area. In terms of, as I say, I break this down in terms of both corporate performance and then stakeholder engagement as ways and important aspects of building that confidence. And just to tick off probably important points in that regard, I think corporate performance involves things like engagement with other organizations in the industry, particularly in the United States, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, worldwide, the World Association of Nuclear Operators, other types of working groups and parties. You get lessons learned, you get good practices, you get an opportunity to engage with others. And I think those things are important for better corporate performance. We used to talk about in NRC trying to be a learning organization. And that is, we look at our successes as well as failures in organization performance and in engaging our staff. And I can think of things over the years where NRC, I think, needed to learn better in source security, for example. The GAO stings from about I'm going to say 13 to 15 years ago really put an emphasis on how we needed to improve the control of radioactive sources in the U.S. and ensure that both the NRC and the agreement states, who also have authority, are engaged in that type of thing. And going back, as I say, I started the NRC about 6 or 8 months before the 3 Mile Island accident. And that was probably the, as some people call it, significant emotional event in the nuclear industry in the United States. And overall, I think the ability to learn from that has served the agency, but also the industry well over the years. And again, I think accountability within the organization, and that goes from top to bottom. That's corporate management is engaged on the things that are important, whether it's for security or for safety, but also how do employees understand their role and the significance as pieces of the puzzle that bring better practices and better security and safety together. So those are things I would talk about in general in terms of corporate performance. But then what we also have, I think, is the other end of this and the other side, and that's communication and communication with stakeholders. And the emphasis today on stakeholder communication engagement is, I think, far greater than it certainly was, again, when I started out at the NRC in the 1970s. And I actually recall before I graduated from law school, working at the Commerce Department one summer, and the whole idea of the corporate responsibility, corporate engagement, that was an idea particularly in the 1970s, and I think in the late 1960s, that was coming to the fore. And we still see it. Obviously, we still see it today. But part of that engagement is communication with various stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, we could probably sit here for 15 minutes and list them. You have members of the general public, the neighbor down the street, the local government, the local school district that might be funded by tax support from the facility. You've got other parts of government. You have non-governmental organizations, some for, some against what you're doing. You have any number of folk who may be considered stakeholders. And sometimes they're only stakeholders when they see something or they are only engaged when they see something in the press in terms of poor performance of the facility, or something goes wrong, or maybe it's some industry-wide type event. So you've got, across the spectrum, it's sometimes maybe not difficult to describe who these stakeholders are, but it's important to understand that they may be coming from any number of perspectives. And it means one needs to understand the nature of their potential interest in what you do. And that may mean often, as I say, they may be only engaged when something goes wrong. But the conversation and the communication needs to be a constructive two-way interaction. We need to listen and understand concerns, issues, questions, address relevant concerns in a responsible and understandable fashion. And often that's a difficult thing to do, particularly in an industry using a complex technology, and as we'll, I think, hear perhaps later, is the idea of there are balances and trade-offs, what you have to do between information security and information provision to stakeholders. And that's, again, with communication, information is important, and there's a need to provide general information relevant to topics, whether it's operations, security, emergency response, and information on successful operations, good performance at the plant. If the plant is making the grade with respect to the NRC's oversight program. That's something that can be, that can be focused on. But you also need to prepare to provide information on events and things that happen at the plant. And we have to recognize that those communication avenues are varied. They can be public meetings, they can be the traditional media, social media. One of my best examples, I think, on the question of how things erupt on social media, I know there are actually some examples of, quote, fake news that happen. There's a plant in, I think it was in France, that had an incident, and suddenly blowing up on social media were pictures and hysteria about what was going on. As it turned out, it was a coal-fired, the pictures being provided were a coal-fired plant somewhere else in Europe. It had nothing to do with that one. But another one I experienced in the U.S. When I was the chair was a transformer explosion in the transformer yard at the Indian Point plant. And that was considered under NRC parlance in terms of reporting an unusual event. It didn't require an immediate phone call, but I think it was a 60-minute call. Well, pictures of the fire in the where the transformer was outside the plant were on social media, on Twitter, within a couple minutes of it happening, before NRC had the thing reported to us. So it illustrates the difference that we live in today. Again, if you look at the three significant nuclear power plant accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. Fukushima, we were seeing things almost immediately, although a lot of it, we were seeing the same media or same feed of a video at the plant over and over again. But you were getting fairly up-to-date information or pictures as the event happened. Think about Chernobyl, where you had basically the G7 knocking on Chernobyl.
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Sorry about that. I don't know why that did that. You had Chernobyl, you had the G7 basically saying to Gorbachev, what the hell is going on over there? And that type of thing. And of course, TMI, we were definitely had troubles in terms of communication, things like that. All I'm trying to illustrate for you is, again, how the communication happens today is much different than it was 30 years ago. And you have to be prepared for those types of things. So ultimately, and I'll sort of come to a conclusion in a minute or two here, what does this involve? It involves building trust. And it's often difficult to build. And sometimes I think it's very easily lost. But that public confidence is important, I think, and a prerequisite to successful, credible communication with your stakeholders. And it plays an important role how we accept and people accept and respond to risk. If we don't trust the regulator or the operator, if we don't know them well enough to place our trust in them, we're skeptical of their risk calculations and their risk communication, I think. So credibility is built on two pillars. It is built on expertise. It's not about lording expertise over others, but it's about trying to use that to assure folk to communicate well with them. And it's difficult to achieve because it is difficult sometimes to make those types of communications on complex technical issues. And the public, you do need to have the public feel respected and communicated with. It's not just talking down, it's trying to engage, and there are different ways of doing that. And so the part of the challenge, I think, is to practice that plain language, that plain communication with folk, to translate the complex and sometimes difficult subject matter into a meaningful communication that engages you with those stakeholders. And it means learning from mistakes, whether it occurs during an exercise or during a regular work situation or during some small crisis that you have. And developing those communication plans are very important. And balancing openness and the demands to maintain confidentiality certainly are sometimes difficult, but important. It is an important focus of what you do. And this is particularly a challenge in the security area, as we all know. And I think back to after 9/11 at the NRC, we basically had a lot of information up on our website about the individual reactors and things like that. And we wound up shutting down all that stuff for some weeks because of the concern about whether it was providing too much information about details about, not so much about how do I get in through this gate, or can I, burrow under the gate or into the plant, but things like in terms of what are the vulnerabilities with respect to equipment and things like that. So I think this is an interesting project because, as I said at the beginning, I think it really touches on these two important areas that, basically corporate governance, corporate responsibility, but also the outreach that an operator has to its stakeholders, the public near it, the other governmental organizations, and the people, American people at large. And that's why I'm eager to hear Deborah and Catherine's presentations, because I think what I found very interesting about the template, it really touches on these important aspects of the engagement in terms of doing these types of security assessments. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Burns. That was a really interesting talk, and I liked how you highlighted the importance of stakeholder engagement and some of the best ways to do this, and some of the challenges related to it as well. So I do appreciate that. Our next speaker, Deborah Decker, is a senior advisor at the Stimson Center, where she works on cyber and nuclear security issues. She has advised the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security on strategy and risk, and has specialized in the threats stemming from weapons of mass destruction and in the vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure. And she's really been, a really important part of conceptualizing this project and moving it forward. So I'm very excited to hear what she has to say. Deborah, take it away.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Commissioner Burns, for opening this up and leading with some of the important issues that we need to face and the importance of the governance template. So my colleague Catherine and I will be presenting on how do you achieve good governance and why. Next slide. So next slide, thank you. I thought we needed a little levity here, so that's what we're going to surf into this project. But why are we here? This project started with the Obama administration's interest in increasing nuclear security. As President Obama said, and I quote, "Nuclear security is a 21st century challenge that no one country or one institution can solve alone." Yes, that administration would end, but the security focus wouldn't have to. For us, the task from our funders was to find whether security could be deeply embedded in the interests of licensees. The question was, is there a way to ensure civil nuclear security beyond regulatory minimums? We think there is. We just needed to find the business case for nuclear security. So let me first give you an overview of what we're going to be discussing. First, the project concept and how to develop this business case. Part of it involves how do you define good security, and then you find the incentives for good security. And then my colleague Catherine will talk about actually modeling the business case for this, which became the governance template. Next slide. So the industry itself, we think of it as not growing, but it actually will be. And I foresee it greatly growing, especially internationally, both with future new reactors, climate change, energy, water needs. And as it grows, it still will remain a terrorist target, as it had been since, well, at least since 9/11, when we knew that nuclear power plants were on the hit list. But regulations, so how do we address this? Regulations are important, but the world can't depend on regulatory minimums to ensure nuclear security. Regulatory authorities in some countries may not have the capability or the capacity to oversee compliance with regulations. Also, as we all know, government and regulations are slow to change, and if overly prescriptive, can be not only burdensome, but also counterproductive. So what's the answer? We think it's cost-effective security. Next slide. We first considered who, in addition to regulators, was helping to address nuclear security. How is it defined? Well, the International Atomic Energy Agency does a great job in developing guidance documents for security, but these are guidance only, slow to be published, and the world changes fast. Also, the security publications are not coordinated enough, we found, with the IAEA safety standards to make implementation of both safety and security reviews easy for operators to do. As one said to me, it's like, am I going to spend 6 weeks doing a security review 1 year for security culture and 6 weeks the next year to do it on safety culture? So it all just takes too long to do these separate reviews. The IAEA also has IPAS, which is International Physical Protection Advisory Service missions, that many countries have taken advantage of. But these are, first of all, when I say many, it's not even half the countries, but they are often limited in scope. And to be well done, they require follow-up missions. Not all countries do the first mission, let alone the second mission. The World Association, so in looking for who else is reviewing, besides regulators, some of these operations, we found the World Association of Nuclear Operators, WANO, and the US Office INPO, the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations, do periodic peer reviews, but these consider safety, not security. Internationally, the World Institute for Nuclear Security, WINS, supports great security training, but again, this is voluntary training for licensees. Others support nuclear security, such as with exercises, but not necessarily the development of good embedded standards. How can you be self-motivated to do good security? And almost all of these efforts we found are not made public, so they don't get rewarded. So what's to be done? Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So to develop there's some links on the bottom too, if you could put up, Trin, thanks. To develop a business case for nuclear security, you need the industry stakeholders to come together to decide on what are the good practices that are necessary as well as sufficient to merit reward. After much research and many discussions with stakeholders, we saw possible benefits from industry along with other stakeholders together developing voluntary consensus standards. We can talk more about what those are later if you'd like, and we presented our paper, Nuclear Energy Securing the Future, a case for voluntary consensus standards at industry's request at the Joint Industry Civil Nuclear Summit in 2016. The paper points out the plethora of standards development bodies around the world beyond the international standards organizations, the ISOs, which you may have heard of, and includes statements from industry calling for some standards. So we jumped into the standards development world more. If you were compliant with some performance standards, could you get benefits from insurers, financiers, regulators, the public? So we looked at what standards had been developed already, including especially in the nuclear world, and where standards really work to ensure better quality practices to those who follow them, including especially within the nuclear industry. What benefits could come from compliance with these standards? You can find some of that research in another piece we wrote, a policy brief called The Quest for Nuclear Security. So quality standards for nuclear products themselves have been in use in the nuclear field with many standards developed, and these come from, mainly from like ASME, ASTM, some from ASIS, and we can talk if you'd like to go more into standards development in the Q&A later. But the issue, of course, is adhering to these standards, and that's just in the product quality area, and Korea had a problem with this. So all of these things we talked about so far have been standards that apply to some extent in the industry, and we looked at whether or not these would make a difference. However, I have to say we found very significantly in story after story that standards might be necessary, but were certainly not sufficient. So often standards can become a check the box routine. This became clearer as we pursued discussions with OECD's Nuclear Energy Agency in our quest to find the conditions from which benefits could accrue for good security. How can you demonstrate good security? The Nuclear Energy Agency, the NEA, under Director General Bill Magwood, has heavily emphasized the importance of human and organizational elements in nuclear safety culture. Again, they're dealing in safety. In talking with NEA, we agreed that good governance was the key to good security, just as it is to safety. Standards may be good, but are not sufficient. Next slide. Next slide, please. Is it not going up? It's a nice slide. The next slide is a governance slide. I don't know if you all can see it, but my screen is frozen. So could you create a governance framework for good nuclear security governance that would prove cost effective for operators? That is, it could drive licensee benefits so that they would use it. We're not talking about a 100-page document that is an in-depth standard or an IAEA guidance, but a framework for management, for reflection, review, documentation, and perhaps also a tool for communicating with stakeholders that shows management has seriously reflected on and pursued good security measures. Industry was already thinking along these lines and had presented an initial security governance framework itself. We took that initial draft of a governance framework that was presented at the last Nuclear Security Summit and further developed it in discussions with operators, insurers, regulators, lawyers, and more. We looked to other industry sectors, aviation, maritime, the chemical industry, and built out the framework in more detail. We supplemented it with IAEA guidance. Oh, if you could go back on the slides. Go back, more. Thank you, more. That's it. I like that slide. So you can see there the standards are the base, and governance really drives culture, which drives compliance with standards. Next, that's good. Let's stay there. Thank you. So I'm sorry, I lost where I am. Just a second. So we looked at, could you gain, if you could develop a good governance template that was not that difficult, a framework for management, for reflection, review, documentation, and perhaps also a tool for communicating with stakeholders that shows management has seriously reflected on and pursued good security measures. So here are some of the groups that then we thought about and talked to when we looked at developing this tool and working with them to develop it. So when we talked, and regulators are not on here, but we did talk to regulators about it, and the response, and this was some international regulators, not just in the US, and regulators are a primary concern of the licensees. What did regulators say about this? They said, simply put, yes, it's another tool in the regulatory toolkit, if it can be communicated to us. Turning to the market now, what about insurance? Could insurance be an incentive for organizations to improve security? Let me explain insurance to start. There are lots of different kinds of insurance. The two major categories are property insurance, which includes business continuity, and liability insurance, which covers third parties. Nuclear insurers and their pools are special entities and are different from the commercial insurance you might have for your house. We can talk again in more detail that later if you'd like. So the nuclear insurers, they do survey nuclear operations and assess risk, and the pools are interrelated, sharing each other's national risks. So any potential loss at one nuclear entity is ultimately shared by others. So they have an interest in ensuring good security. But we found, however, that losses related to liabilities for radiation releases are generally capped by treaties or by national legislation. The only question is whether you will get insurance or not that much, to some extent, the cost of it. And in only a few cases internationally have insurers requested changes in an enterprise's operating procedures before confirming underwriting. So cyber is one of the key areas, however, that worried nuclear insurers. As the policies had been silent on cyber losses and liabilities, they were included by default. The pools have now followed the market trend, that is specifically exclude cyber and property insurance policies, and operators have shown a lack of interest to separately insure it. They self-insure or don't insure. So the nuclear pools exclude, cyber from nuclear third-party liability for radiological events. But as I mentioned, these are generally capped. However, Catherine will talk later about liability for non-nuclear events, and this was significant and can be a driver. Then we talk to financiers. If you show good governance of security, could you get better terms? So security risk, we found, is not a concern for export finance institutions or those financing new bills. However, for going concerns, enterprises that were already operating, security can be a factor. Organizations are sensitive to changes in their risk profiles because they get evaluated by credit rating agencies like Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and others around the world. Stock analysts and investor advisors all have a lot to say. Public companies, private companies. I mean, I thought it was just going to be public companies, which doesn't create a lot of, a lot of these nuclear field operators in the nuclear field are not publicly traded. However, public companies, private companies, utilities that have nuclear generation, government-owned entities, they can all get rated. So what does good governance of security mean to them? If their ratings go down, the cost of borrowing goes up, including on new debt issues. The value of the company itself can go down with lower stock ratings for poor governance. This impacts both public and private equity investors' valuations of the company. So in particular, we found that good governance, at least over cyber risks, is something that concerns investors and lenders and something that operators must pay attention to. What about other ratings groups? Many groups, in addition to the standard credit rating agencies, are now looking to rate governance as part of the environmental, social, and governance evaluations, or what is commonly known as ESG.
Deborah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
this is my last point.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry, the slides got stopped and that put me off a bit. So the trend to invest with your values is increasing, but the governance evaluations that ESG groups do not yet include good governance of safety and security that would protect workers in the environment. We see this changing, especially as we see ESG and credit ratings being developed into more finely tuned and integrated models. Thus, in the future, the use of good governance template may help with ESG and credit ratings. So the last issue, liability and reputation, is something that Catherine will talk about. Thank you, and I'm happy to talk about any of these issues a lot more.
Deborah, thank you so much for talking about the evolution of the project and the steps along the way. Our next speaker has been very involved in this process as well. Catherine Rahud is an attorney specializing in international security. She works primarily in the field of cyber and nuclear security accountability and liability issues. She's a member of the California Bar Association, the American Bar Association, and the International Nuclear Lawyers Association, and her expertise has been critical in helping to develop the concept and the steps and the research along the way. So I'm very excited for Catherine's talk, and then hopefully we will have time for Q&A afterwards. Thank you. Catherine, take it away. Can somebody unmute Catherine?
Here. Okay, there we go. Deborah and I were still on what we called our search for market incentives. We were in closest contact at that time with the insurers. While they were very firm that their role was not to be standard setters for industry, they were auditing operators on an annual basis to set premiums, and security was included in this audit. We talked about how operators could fare better in these audits, what issues were, and that insurers could help us retool the governance template. So we chose cyber for a number of reasons. We were post-Stuxnet, and that was the cyber attack, if you remember, in Iran, which caused centrifuges to spin out of control. The fact that cyber could cause physical damage was a groundbreaking discovery and threw a huge amount of risk into play for operators. As Deborah mentioned, cyber was very different from the rest of potential nuclear attacks. If a cyber attack does not cause a release of radiation, there is no government backstop in place. Operators are now on the front line, there is no insurance, and they are worried about liability. We had a tool that could help them build a case. The governance template. And as any scientific experiment and scientist knows, any hypothesis needs to be tested, and we had just the right players to test this one. We now had, as a result of these several years, a retinue of insurers, nuclear operators, regulators, and lawyers who were on board, ready to help, and equally interested in answers to the questions we had been asking. In 2016, we gathered the first of 3 invitation-only roundtables in London, where we presented the cyber scenario through a moderator and demonstrated to the participants that there was indeed the potential for civil and criminal liability in a terrorist incident, which caused potential for power supply and in a catastrophic incident. And in this incident, people will always ask, who is at fault and how could it have been prevented? The governance template gives the operator the chance to tell their story and to disprove negligence. And it gives their attorney, most of all, a tool to talk to the jury. What the operator can do is say that they are accountable. They can take ownership of the incident, but that they took all reasonable efforts to prevent the incident. Complete security is never possible, and it is not to be expected. And we'll talk about that a little later. The second roundtable was my favorite. It was about a year later, and it was in London, also in London. All 3 were in London. And I should mention, I was in Vienna at that time. I was in Vienna for 10 years. I'm now relocated in San Francisco. And so the second was in barristers' chambers. And we actually had judges who judged the hypothetical incident. And we used the governance template to see whether or not that affected negligence and liability. And the third roundtable, we actually brought the governance template and asked the attendees, and there were many of the same attendees. That was really, I think, very exciting. And we asked them to help kind of retool the governance template. So the governance template is a living document, and it's continued to be refined, and it will continue to change over time. But one issue is that the operators continued to complain to us that they could never achieve complete security. You know, I'm still on the second slide, but don't worry, Nick, I only have a few slides here. So this is the second slide, and I wanted to say that and make a point. This is an excellent slide. This was by an expert at the IAEA who's no longer there, Don Dudenhofer, and operators can never achieve complete security, and they only need to achieve that which is reasonable. Commissioner Burns was talking about this, and what is not reasonable is beyond the design basis threat, and this is the role of the state. And so this slide basically shows that as the threat increases, the role of the state increases and the role of the operator decreases. And I highly recommend, this is a really good tool. And I highly recommend that if you choose to download these slides, that this one would be a great slide to keep in your toolbox. So next slide, please. All right, so actually the one point that I wanted to make here on this slide is that best practices change over time, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. And also that the template is something that's designed to right-size security. So it doesn't necessarily mean that good security is additional security or that it has to be expensive. It could mean that your security that you already have when you're doing your risk assessment has to just be realigned or right-sized with what you have. So when you look at your safety, your security, and your other operational expenses, you may be spending too much money. I don't know, for example, if you have a biology or a patent department, you might want to be realigning those expenses. And for example, the template is asking you to do things that are not expensive. For example, the first question, and again, it has changed over time, so I'm not sure if this is exactly in the right order. But the first question at that time is, do you have a security policy? And we gave an example of what a security policy looks like. The second question was, do you have a cybersecurity officer? Because we were focusing on cyber at the same time. If you don't have a cybersecurity officer because perhaps your company is too small to have a cybersecurity officer, do you have someone who's responsible for cyber who reports directly to the board, and so on, cybersecurity training. So these are things that are not necessarily expensive. It is not like gates, guards, and guns, which could be additional security that would be very expensive. Next slide, please. Okay. And so again, I wanted to just emphasize that the governance template will help the operators articulate that they have demonstrated the necessary standard of care and that they are current within, that they are reasonable within the current threats and available precaution, and that they are current within the available precautions. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is actually my favorite slide, and it is the TJ Hooper case, which is happened in 1928, and I still have participants who ask me for a paper in which we wrote about the TJ Hooper case, and we've talked about it in almost every one of our roundtables because it's such a good illustration of how you do how you would do a cost-benefit analysis when you're demonstrating reasonableness. So the tugboat company, there was a tugboat company that lost its cargo in a very bad storm at sea. And the cargo owner sued the tugboat company because the tugboat actually had failed to install a functional radio. And the tugboat company said that this constituted negligence. And the defendant argued that the industry practice with the other tugboats was that there were no radios, but therefore it wasn't in the standard of care. But the court ruled in favor of the plaintiff and awarded damages and said it was negligent because the standard of care was not the best, what the best practice should have been, and it wasn't reasonably practicable when he did a cost-benefit analysis. And he actually did a numerical cost-benefit analysis, and his name was Judge Learned Hand. Evidently, his parents knew when he was born that he was going to become a very famous judge, and I think he would be very happy that almost 100 years later, he is still being talked about. And so what you can see is that because the cost of a radio was insignificant in comparison to the cost of the cargo, and because a radio, that technology was available, the tugboats should have been using it. And this is something that comes into always comes into reasonableness when you're looking at reasonableness and when you're looking at what industry practices should be. Next slide. Oh, okay. So this is my last slide, and this is the template's benefits. So basically, this will help operators. First of all, I actually haven't talked too much about reputation, but the template is a contract with the public. It is going to be published, or it should be published with the annual statement. Excuse me, yes, the annual statement. And It's a contract with the public so that the public can track what the operator is doing, and it helps illustrate and track reasonableness. It's a transparent statement of criteria and how the operator is managing risk. It's a written set of risk mitigation protocols, which illustrates regular risk assessments and corresponding personnel training. It documents best practices. And again, when I say best practices, I don't just mean industry practices. It has to be reasonably practicable under the circumstances and at that point in time. And it can communicate to the community and the stakeholders, the owner's attention to risk management. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. And we already have a fair number of interesting questions. And I'll start out with one good one from Edward Kelkowski and I'll paraphrase a little bit, but how should standards vary by location and size of the power plant? And we have a few questions, so I'm going to try and run through as many as possible. Maybe we can start with Commissioner Burns and go from there.
Sure. Well, I think the overall standards, I think, or objectives are probably similar or the same. But I think it is true, it says, depending on what the nature of the technology is, what the siting and things like that, how that's actually implemented may differ. And I think, for example, one of the things that the NRC is going through now, particularly is with the interest in advanced reactor and small, advanced reactors, which tend to be also in the category of small modular reactors, is what's the nature of the security profile, and there's a rulemaking, I think, underway, and I'm blanking on the actual status. It's not. I think it's either in the comment phase or to these proposed rules to come out. But that's one of the things that I think will be looked at in there is what does it mean in terms of these in terms of the technologies. But overall, you still need to achieve, basic overarching security objectives.
That's a good point, and I think the point that the standards shouldn't necessarily change. But one thing I just want to add in terms of implementation, because implicit in the question about location is also perception of threat, which is something we haven't talked about yet. And based on the location and the perceived threats, it's possible that the approach and implementation might change from site to site. Deborah or Catherine, is there anything you want to add on this point?
No, I think, Nick, you hit it right on the head, because as we move, some countries like Canada have performance-based regulations, or more so than the US does. And that perception of that threat and consequences will drive a lot of what's done. Thanks.
Catherine?
No, I have nothing to add on this point.
Let me ask one question that I've been wondering about with regard to the motivational component of the template, which is there's sort of a culture of not sharing information in the nuclear industry, particularly with regards to nuclear security issues. What steps do you think regulators, operators, international institutions can help to sort of reframe how we think about sharing information? Deborah, you can start, and we'll go from there.
Well, I think we can see the benefits of publicly sharing some of that information, including with not only with the public, but also with having this type of information available for assessments from the regulator, from the and from Moody's and other analytics agencies. So there's so many benefits from it. And it's easy to share without getting into confidential information the way you've structured it, Nick, with the template.
I would like to add that there's absolutely nothing that is even I would say remotely confidential in terms of what the governance template is asking for. This is completely something that would be published in a shareholders report. And, having been an attorney at a laboratory and having a top secret security clearance for 20 years, and always being responsible for classifying things, this is something that would be published easily. So I don't see any reason. I don't know. What about you, Commissioner Burns?
No, I would agree, Catherine, in terms of what the template is, because again, it focuses on objectives we know underlying there. There are things we can't talk about, ultimately you can't talk about. I also give the example of the design basis threat as the NRC is promulgated. There is a public rule, I think in Part 73 of the Title 10 of the Code of Federal Regulations, that describes the design basis threat, which provides basically a framework or a baseline or for what utilities then have to address in their security programs and all that. It doesn't tell you exactly all the details, which are classified or safeguards or classified information, but it does tell you what types of threats you're supposed to be addressing. And that is, you may have a vehicle with a bomb. That's as a result of the World Trade Center incident in 1993, as well as somebody trying to crash through the gates at 3 Mile Island plant. That's when that was lifted up. Cyber is part of that now. So the details of how you prepare yourself, how you prepare yourself for prevention, but also for reaction, those may be very sensitive. But baseline discussions of what it is you need to do, whether it's gates, guards, cyber. That information is out there and that can be shared. And I think of the template, I thought the template, from what I was able to get off the Stimson website, I think does a good job of sort of focusing on those overarching objectives. Because again, I don't need to know what the key code is to get into that door, into the control room or stuff like that. And the public obviously doesn't need to know, but I do need to know. I think it helps me if I think of myself as that stakeholder about what is it, what's the nature of protection? What, is it just because I got a lock they bought at Home Depot on the front gate? What is it why should I feel good about this?
So I'm going to try and get to, we're just about hitting the end of our session. I want to address one question from Howard Hall. Has this Stimson team been able to quantify the benefit that accrues to the operators by adopting the template approach? And I think this is a really good question, because one thing that we're really interested in doing is creating a test case for the template and seeing how it actually can be applied to operators. And one thing I want to emphasize is that what you see on the website is just a piece of the template, and there's a larger component to it. So I would encourage everyone, if they're interested, to reach out to us to talk about what further steps can be taken. In the last minute, I feel like we don't have time to jump into all the questions, but maybe I could just give all of our speakers a couple seconds to make some last comments, and then we can wrap up. Catherine, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is to own the accountability. So I think I can't emphasize that enough. I think instinctually that it's very instinctual to try to deny that it was your fault. And I think in this particular case, when there is a catastrophic incident, you actually have to own the accountability, and you have to explain what you did to everything that you did to prevent it. And and again, that you cannot prevent it. It is not something there's no such thing as complete security. So that would be my final remark.
Commissioner Burns?
Well, again, I think what I emphasize is that along the lines, this all becomes a learning experience for, I think, companies who are responsible for integrating security into their programs, or integrating safety and security, but also carrying out those programs. So I think that continual focus on learning from what you've observed, and that can be through anything from day-to-day, the day-to-day engagements, that can be from your own, the self-executed force-on-force exercises, from the more general force-on-force types exercises, and again, engagement with these both national and international partners who have a perspective on security.
So I have just been informed that we in fact have 15 more minutes, which is great. But I couldn't agree more with the 2 points that were just made. Deborah, I mean, we're rolling right now. So
Okay, good, because I saw there were a lot of questions. I was surprised when you were calling it to a halt. So the question was, how can we quantify this? Well, the cost of doing this template, going through it is very inexpensive. Then the adjustments you may have to make in your organization to address some of the risks. So one of the questions is, have you done a risk assessment? If not, why not? And you should. And doing that risk assessment may take some work. So it depends on the organization how much it will cost to do some of these things. But the benefits, in terms of quantifying the benefits, I think in the future, after talking to rating agencies and different analytics groups, especially when we're dealing with a lot of data-rich things, they're measuring things. And this is one of the measures that will go into it. And if you care at all about your ESG or any of your credit ratings, this could be helpful to you. Reputationally, it could be helpful to you, as Catherine and Commissioner Burns pointed out, and it'll make life easier with your regulators. As one regulator had said to me, when we know you're working on your culture and governance, maybe, this was off the record, and I won't say what country it was, we'll change in our oversight program from like, oh, we're really worried about you, to maybe a little bit less. In terms of insurance, it's such a complex topic, and how insurance gets priced. Insurance doesn't get priced just based on risk. It depends on if someone else wants to ask that, I'm happy to go into it, because it'll take me a few minutes to do that. But it's not going to make that much difference to you insurance pricing wise. It may make some difference, but it's not going to be a driving force. The real thing is what Catherine found, I think, is in potential liability in case of an incident. And I'm in Texas right now. We were without power, and that happened not because of a terrorist act, but because of natural hazard, the storm that we had. There are a lot of lawsuits going on. But if you had done something like this on a safety for natural hazards and looked at, do we have good governance for it, you could be absolved of some of those lawsuits. So that's the kind of thing that we were looking at for security. And I think Texas is a great example of lawsuits and how to address that.
So we have another question. We have a number of questions. An interesting one about HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium. Considering some of the advanced reactors that are going to use HALEU with enrichments greater than 10% and lower than 20% and become Category 2 facilities, does the security governance framework that we're talking about account for the differences within LEU with light water reactors? Who wants to take that one on?
Well, I would just say that HALEU is as an attorney, is out of my bandwidth. However, this is an extremely adaptable instrument. So it would adapt to any kind of advanced reactor, micro reactor, a HALEU reactor. It's a quality assurance tool, really. I mean, that's at the bottom, it's a quality assurance tool. And I also wanted to address in a more kind of practical way, the previous question about, I just wanted to say, sort of in a cost way, that what would happen, and in a practical way, is that Stimson would actually go out to facility and would sit down with senior management and the board or the board. Now, I'm not sure the board members would be available. And they would walk through the governance template and help answer the questions. And that would probably take a couple of days. And really the cost would just be it would be sort of the cost to Stimson of doing that. And there would be some training cost associated with that. And so I'm not actually familiar with what those numbers are, but those would be, some of the costs. And then of course they would be the costs that Deborah is talking about. But again, this is not the kind of costs that we're talking about with the design basis threat, when that changes over time and all of a sudden now you have to, for example, be able to defend against, an airplane in a new facility. So it's not that kind of a cost. It's really can be very, very minor and can be right-sized.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm happy to field the HALO question, which is that broadly speaking, I would hope that operators would be able to use the template to adjust for whatever risk factors they might perceive from different types of fuel. And then certainly they could adjust processes and questions based on HALO or whatever new concepts were related to advanced reactors. So I think the malleability of the tool is, an important feature of it.
And I just want to point out one thing. We talked not only to nuclear power plant operators, but we also talked to others in the nuclear industry. So you can talk about fuel fabrication or, so
facilities. This
other
covered facilities.
Another question, Deborah, are you expecting insurers to have multiple tiers of, for example, liability insurance for nuclear facilities? For those that follow and those that who do not follow nuclear security governance framework? And if so, do the insurers foresee this tier system creating a discount tier for current rates for an increased tier from the current rates? And I should say, I have a follow-up question to you to this as well, but I'll let all of you field it first.
Okay, so it's different in different places. In the United States, for example, INPO, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, is a mutual insurer, and and then that they focus on property and business continuity. And then there's the the liability insurers. And so,
Insurance.
right, thank you, nuclear insurance. And so, it's interesting that, for example, in NEIL, as a mutual, they only started doing a risk-based assessment on their plants, pricing wise, maybe about 3-4 years ago. And they, in the United States, and I'm sure Commissioner Burns can talk to this much better, there is an assessment across all the plants of how well you're doing. INPO does that. And INPO will rate you like 1 to, I don't even know, was it 1 to 4, 1 to 5?
1 to 5.
1 to 5. Okay. And based on that now, NEIL is doing some pricing for how well the plant is being operated on a risk basis. But insurance is really driven, and this is really not by risk, because we did another project where we looked at insurance pricing, because originally Homeland Security had gone to America insurers overall and said, hey, we could just follow you and do risk assessments. This was after 9/11. And then I learned a lot about insurance, and that it's based on how much you have in your reserves. How much were you had to pay out that year? Because of claims and losses. What are you getting in terms of interest income on your reserves? And then what's the competitive market? So, who I go to will change the pricing. So it's not just a risk-based, they do have risk assessors within all the insurance companies and doing audits and assessments, but the actual price itself may change. So, but the short answer to your question is yes. I mean, what we found is there will be some risk-adjusted prices, or it could be deductions, but it wasn't as big of a driver, we found, as we thought it would have been in the very beginning. And I have the other panelists add to that.
Commissioner Burns, your thoughts on this?
I'm a little out of touch on the insurance stuff, but it makes sense. As Deborah said, where you stand in the INPO evaluations has always been an important thing. And again, as we've touched on a number of times, I know the discussions I had with insurers in the in the EU when I was at NEA sort of reflect this. And I always sort of said that if you're talking about something outside the quote normal or the expected regulatory framework, insurers have an important influence in this.
Catherine, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, and just very quickly, so the insurance aspect of the rating equals, so your insurance is adjusted based on the rating, but the best performer gets about a $200,000 break in the insurance, which really doesn't mean anything in terms of operational costs. So what the rating does is it's really about peer review and prestige among your peers. So it really isn't about the $200,000 break. That's really minimal. And INPO is the only organization that does that rating system. So there are no other insurers that do it. And they don't do it because it really wouldn't move the needle. So some, I don't know, I mean, some might do it. I actually don't remember the particulars, but what we found is that the amount of the pricing adjustment would not move the needle in terms of motivating the operators.
So just to clarify, so Neil does the pricing and INPO does the rating.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna withhold my follow-up questions. I think it was covered already, but I think there's a really important question here, which is that's been asked in the chat box, which is essentially, what is the relationship of performance-based metrics rather than prescriptive to helping sort of address some of the issues, and what's its relation that we've been discussing, and what's its relationship to the template itself? Deborah, do you want to take
Well, I want to nominate Commissioner Burns to talk about performance versus prescriptive metrics, because there's this whole trend internationally in the industry on that should be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak sort of generally. I mean, this has been an ongoing tension, and frankly, I think even for the NRC, which is considered more prescriptive, although if we had time to go into arguments, I could say, let's look at that a little more carefully. It is more prescriptive than, say, like in the UK, which sets very high level standards, which then if somebody wants to license a plant, has to meet. Whereas the NRC does have sort of a listing. But this is an ongoing tension between the performance-based, also risk-informed. And that, what I would say internationally, is generally the trend in terms of regulation. Just one example, I remember very early in my career when the fire protection rule, NRC, was underway. And I had some role working on it, was one of the things that the staff was going to do is say, you need to have a fire brigade of 5 persons, specifically 5 persons. And they threw that out to go to more, you need to have an effective fire brigade. And that's probably a good example of very prescriptive versus moving toward what do we really need? And that performance-based is really I think the trend, and also I think overall probably helps us get to where we need to be. It can be more difficult on the regulator sometimes and in terms of enforcement. Let me leave it there so the others can talk.
And we're actually just, we're at time, I apologize, but I would point out that the template is sort of an interesting combination of performance-based concepts, but also prescriptive measures. And I would say that certainly the prescriptive measures don't carry as much weight without that performance-based component, which is really essential. So we are just about at time, but again, I would like to thank all of my speakers. It's been a fascinating conversation, a great Q&A. Thank you to the audience who submitted excellent questions. And unfortunately, in this Zoom format, the audience can't applaud for the speakers, or they can, but you can't see them. So I'm just gonna, applaud all of you on my own and say, thank you so much. And should any of the audience members have questions, feel free to email myself or any of our speakers, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.